I built an entire restaurant on the back of a stolen recipe. Not my stolen recipe, mind you, but my recipe that they stole. This isn't a pity party. It's a celebration of turning a scandalous betrayal into a thriving culinary empire. Get ready to witness how I transformed a shocking act of theft into the sweetest success story you've ever tasted. In the small coastal town of Fairview, tucked between quiet streets and family-owned shops, there stood a little bakery known as Hearth and Honey. It wasn't fancy or famous, but for the locals it was a hidden gem, a place where comfort lived in every bite. The bakery's signature item was a honey lavender pie, a dessert so delicate and rich that customers swore it was addictive. The recipe was my creation, a culmination of years of experimentation, sleepless nights, and a relentless pursuit of perfection. It wasn't just a dessert. It was a piece of my identity. But where there's success, envy always finds its way in. Her name was Laura, my best friend, business partner, and the person I trusted more than anyone in the world. We met in culinary school, two dreamers bound by flower-dusted ambitions and the promise of creating something beautiful together. For years, we built Hearth and Honey from the ground up, mixing passion with perseverance. We shared everything until the day I noticed something off. At first, it was small, unexplained absences, private phone calls, whispered conversations when she thought I wasn't around. Then came the evening she didn't show up for the dinner rush, the busiest shift of the week. I brushed it off, thinking she was just exhausted. But the next morning she was gone, and so was my recipe notebook. It wasn't just any notebook. Inside were the blueprints of Hearth and Honey, the formulas, the techniques, the secret balances of texture and flavor that made our pastries legendary. It was everything, years of work in neat, scribbled lines and stained pages. 2 weeks later, the betrayal became public. A sleek new restaurant opened across town, amber table. The logo, the colors, even the rustic aesthetic, they all looked painfully familiar. But what cut the deepest was the menu. Front and center was the honey lavender pie. Pie, my creation. The same crust texture, the same drizzle pattern, even the same tiny flakes of edible gold leaf, a finishing touch I'd invented on a whim. The first bite of that stolen dessert, tasted under the guise of a curious customer, was like poison wrapped in sugar. People began whispering that Amber Table was the next big thing, that its owner, Laura, was a culinary genius, that her pies were revolutionary. The local paper ran a glowing review, praising her innovation and artistry. And I was left with an empty bakery and a hollow chest. Customers started fatting. Some thought Amber Table was our sister brand. Others assumed I was the imitator. Sales plummeted. Even my suppliers began cutting deals with Laura, lured by the prestige of her growing success. The town that once celebrated me now looked past me, dazzled by her spotlight. The bitterness wasn't just emotional, it was survival. Hearth and Honey teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. The late bills, the empty chairs, the heavy silence of a dying dream, it all weighed on me like a curse. For weeks, I shut myself inside the bakery, baking through the nights, trying to reclaim what had been taken. Every attempt to reinvent myself failed. Nothing felt right. Every dish tasted like resentment. But as despair turned into rage, something inside me began to shift. Late one night, sitting among flour-dusted counters and stacks of unpaid invoices, I realized something. She hadn't stolen my gift. She stolen my work, but the mind behind it, the creativity, the passion, those were still mine. And that was something she could never replicate. That night, I tore through my old notes, reworking every recipe, adjusting flavors, pushing boundaries. I stopped trying to resurrect Hearth and Honey. Instead, I envisioned something entirely new, something bold, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. If she had stolen from me to build her empire, I would build one that dwarfed hers. It wouldn't be a bakery. It would be a statement, a restaurant that screamed originality, a dining experience that would make her stolen version look like a cheap imitation. And every plate served would carry a silent message. I made this from the ashes of betrayal. By dawn, my plan was in motion. The lease papers for Hearth and Honey lay on the counter, but I wouldn't renew them. That chapter was over. I needed a new beginning. I started making calls, reaching out to investors, architects, designers, anyone who could help bring my vision to life. Most laughed at me. Some doubted I'd ever recover, but one small investor, an old customer who had watched my downfall with quiet sympathy, offered me a chance. It wasn't much, just enough to get started, but it was all I needed. The day I closed the doors to Hearth and Honey, I didn't look back. I walked through the empty shop one last time, running my fingers along the wooden counters we built together, the walls that had absorbed years of laughter and tears. Then I locked the door. The next morning, demolition began. The scent of lavender and honey faded into dust and debris as I watched my old bakery crumble. It hurt, but it was necessary. Destruction was the first step toward creation. Out of the ruins, I would build something stronger, a restaurant that would rise like fire from sugar and smoke, a place where I would reclaim my name, my pride, and my legacy. But more than that, it would be the stage for my revenge, because I wasn't just going to succeed. I was going to make sure she watched every moment of it happen. And as the construction crews tore down the last pieces of Hearth and Honey, I felt something inside me ignite, not anger, but purpose. A storm was coming to Fairview. And it smelled like victory. The blueprint for revenge began like any proper recipe, with meticulous measurements, precise timing, and an obsession for detail. In the quiet hours when Fairview slept and the town's gossip dimmed to a low hum, I turned my anger into a methodology. Revenge, I decided, would not be messy. It would be elegant, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It would taste like triumph. I studied Laura the way a chef studies a rival's technique. Her menus, her decor choices, the way she staged photos for social feeds. I mapped every move she made, cataloging patterns and vulnerabilities. She had built a castle on borrowed mortar, and castles have windows. The first step was to find those windows. The second was to pry them open. My new restaurant would be named Providence. The word felt heavy and perfect: fate, deliverance, a poetic return of balance. Providence would not be a mere eating place. It would be theater, a deliberate orchestration of senses. Every element, from the cutlery to the playlist, would be configured to deliver an experience so visceral that patrons would not just return, they would worship. I imagined long communal tables, candlelight that softened edges, a kitchen visible through glass where heat and steam became part of the show. The menu would be a series of revelations, each course a chapter in a story that began with betrayal and ended in reckoning. I began assembling my team like a general selects lieutenants. I recruited a pastry chef whispered about in culinary forums, a sous who had trained in Michelin kitchens, a sommelier who could speak to wine as if translating poetry. They were drawn less by money than by the electric clarity of my vision. When I presented the concept, their eyes sharpened. They understood the hunger for comeback. They wanted to be part of something that burned with purpose. Designing Providence became an obsession. I sketched floor plans, argued with fabricators over the curve of a banquette, insisted that the lighting fall like secret whispers across faces. The space needed to feel intimate yet grand, familiar yet otherworldly. The menu would be rooted in comfort but elevated by audacity, a fine line to walk. I remixed textures and flavors into paradoxes, crisp and pillowy, acidic and sweet, rustic and refined. The honey lavender note that once defined me would not be erased. It would be transformed, woven into new compositions like an old motif resurfacing stronger, more nuanced. Marketing, I realized, would be the scalpel that opened the town's eye. Instead of shouting, I would create a slow-burning curiosity. I seeded rumors with tasteful mystery, a trattoria that respected local farmers, a kitchen that reclaimed forgotten techniques, a chef who had returned to reclaim her art. Social posts were sparse but haunting: close-up shots of hands shaping dough, steam rising from a pot, a single herb crowned on a plate. The local press, hungry for a story, began to whisper. Bloggers speculated. Old customers tilted their heads, trying to place the style that felt familiar but different. Meanwhile, Providence's menu development was a laboratory of emotion. I experimented like a chemist and an artist. I took the honey lavender essence and reframed it, not as a novelty but as a lineage. It would appear in a roasted root vegetable glaze, in a reduction paired with game, in a subtle infusion within pickled components that brightened and complicated. Each use was a statement, not theft reclaimed, but heritage revised. I tested textures obsessively, aiming for a juxtaposition that made diners pause and reconsider what they knew about simple ingredients. If Laura had presented a pale imitation, mine would be a layered manifesto. There were legal consultations, too. I wanted to understand my options: intellectual property, trade secrets, the messy ethics of creative theft. The law offered hints but no neat victory. Recipes live in the gray between artistry and formula. I filed what I could and cataloged every date-stamped note, every witness who could testify about who had been in the bakery and when. It felt petty and prudent at once, a scaffolding for a larger plan. If the law could not brand her as a thief, Providence's success would. The construction of Providence was a spectacle in itself. The contractor I hired worked quickly, turning empty space into a vessel for my anger-turned ambition. The open kitchen rose like a stage, a hearth framed with steel and glass. The pantry walls were lined with jars and ribbons of spices, their labels handwritten as if promising stories yet to be told. The bar became an altar of bottles and flamed citrus peels. Everywhere, there were deliberate nods to memory: reclaimed wood from an old dock shed, tiles patterned like the streets of my childhood, a mural painted by an artist who captured the town's light and shadow. Word continued to ripple through Fairview. People speculated about the woman starting a new place. Some said Providence would never match Amber Table's glossy fame. Others murmured that the owner's return would either make or break the town's food scene. I watched these currents like a sailor reading wind and tide, adjusting sails, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And then a strategic decision. I would not simply open the doors and hope. Providence's launch would be a carefully timed reveal. The first seatings would be invite-only, populated by critics, influencers, and those with sway in culinary circles. For 2 nights, Providence would be a secret shared among the powerful, an intimate whisper rather than a shout. If the critics rose, their words would cascade through the town like a flood. Training the staff became my obsession. I taught them not only technique but narrative. They needed to understand that every plate carried intention, that the way a spoon was placed, the angle of a garnish, the temperature of a sauce, all of it was choreography. We drilled service timings until movements were muscle memory. The kitchen practiced the ballet of tickets and mise en place. The pastry team rehearsed the crescendo of desserts, a finale that would fold my old honey lavender into something transcendent, a last note that would bind the meal into a cathartic arc. Behind the scenes, I orchestrated subtle provocations. I arranged for a few of Amber Table's regulars to attend Providence's opening nights, covertly ensuring that bridges would begin to burn between Laura's clientele and mine. I seeded a few well-placed comparisons on social threads, not crude attacks but incisive observations, a critique of sizzle where substance should be, a note about presentation over depth. The aim was not to humiliate through gossip, but to reignite conversation about authenticity and craft. If people began to question the shine of Amber Table, they might remember the tender, messy work that made food unforgettable, the kind of work only a true creator could accomplish. As opening night approached, the tension felt like the pregnant hush before a performance. The staff moved with the discipline of soldiers preparing for dawn. I walked the floor of Providence at odd hours, alone with the hum of refrigeration and the distant clank of pans, tasting, adjusting, refining. Fear and exhilaration braided together, but fear became fuel. I was no longer just rebuilding. I was building the kind of monument that would bend attention toward justice. The night before the first service, I stood at the mouth of the kitchen and imagined the faces who would occupy the tables. I thought of Laura serving her pie across town, unaware that a different narrative was gathering force. I pictured patrons who had lapsed in loyalty returning to Providence, eyes widened, forks poised. I tasted in my mind the final dessert, a reclamation, a sweeter, sharper echo of what had been stolen. It would be a quiet sermon delivered on a plate. A reminder that art cannot be copied into soul. In the early hours, I penned a note to myself, not to be published but to be remembered: build with integrity, triumph with grace. Let success be the loudest revenge. Providence would open not as an act of spite but as an assertion of craft, and in that assertion lay its power. The plan was complete, the cast assembled, the recipes refined. All that remained was to step into the torrent and let the tide of public opinion lift what was owed back into place. As dawn bled into a sky washed with the pale light of a new season, I turned the key in the door one last time before service. The ovens breathed warmth into the room like a patient heart. The staff readied themselves, and the town held its breath, whether they knew it or not. Somewhere across Fairview, a rival flickered under new light. Providence, poised and purposeful, waited to remake the narrative. The stage was set. The first course would drop like the opening strike of a symphony, and everything that followed would be counted in the beats between spoon and mouth. The morning of Providence's opening dawned with a stillness that felt ceremonial, like the pause before an orchestra's first note. Fairview woke slowly, unaware that by nightfall, the town's culinary hierarchy would shift forever. Inside the restaurant, light spilled through tall windows, striking the polished brass, the linen-draped tables, the muted hues of the walls. Everything was deliberate, designed not only for beauty but for memory. Every detail bore the mark of intent. The custom plates, each one subtly unique, reflected the flicker of candlelight like ripples across water. The centerpiece arrangements were minimal, a single stem of lavender in amber glass, a silent nod to the flavor that started it all. Even the air seemed to hum with expectation, thick with the mingled scents of roasted shallots, citrus zest, and the faint sweetness of honey warming on the stove. The kitchen came alive first, a low symphony of controlled chaos. Knives glinted, pans hissed. The rhythmic sound of chopping and searing became a heartbeat, steady and powerful. I moved among my team like a conductor, every motion deliberate, every instruction precise. The ovens roared, the sauces simmered, and Providence inhaled deeply for the first time. This was not just a service. It was the culmination of every sleepless night, every betrayal, every quiet moment of fury turned into creation. Tonight, I would reclaim what had been taken, not with confrontation or accusation, but with undeniable excellence. By sunset, the first guests began to arrive. The door opened to the flicker of flash photography, the murmur of curiosity, the slow, reverent footsteps of those invited into something exclusive. Critics from nearby cities, local influencers, longtime food columnists, each one drawn by whispers of mystery and reinvention. I greeted them personally, not as the wounded baker of Fairview's past, but as the architect of its new future. When they entered the dining room, their eyes widened. The design worked as intended, elegance without intimidation, refinement laced with warmth. The open kitchen gleamed behind glass, its interior a living theater of flame and movement. The guests could see everything: the hands plating the food, the precision of timing, the small nods exchanged between cooks. It was transparency and quiet defiance. The menu that night told a story. Course by course, it built tension, unfolded secrets, and delivered catharsis. The first dish, Ash and Bloom, was a visual contradiction. Chard leaks over a velvety puree of spring peas, symbolizing rebirth from ruin. The second, Echo of Salt, balanced oceanic freshness with earthy smoke, a tribute to resilience. With every bite, diners leaned in, engaged not only with taste but with narrative. Then came the dish that anchored the entire experience, the reclaimed. It was a dessert, the resurrection of the stolen pie, reborn and reimagined. The foundation was familiar, honey and lavender, the flavors that had once defined my downfall. But this version carried evolution. The crust was replaced with a delicate shortbread crumble, the filling deepened with roasted almonds and a hint of sea salt, and a ribbon of caramel spiraled across the top like gold-threaded vengeance. On the plate, the drizzle of honey formed the shape of an infinity loop, deliberate, endless, complete. It wasn't imitation, it was reclamation. When the servers carried out the reclaim, the room fell to hush. The dessert shimmered faintly in candlelight, its aroma pulling people backward and forward in time. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching expressions change. Recognition, awe, silence. The first spoonfuls told me everything. Eyes widened, mouth slowed. People didn't just taste, they felt. The emotion in the room became palpable, curiosity melting into reverence, surprise into surrender. I caught sight of a critic lowering her pen, lost in the experience. Another reached for her phone, recording, whispering a single word that I could read on her lips, extraordinary. In that instant, I knew Providence had done what I set out to achieve. It had spoken louder than any confrontation ever could. But destiny has a flair for timing. Halfway through the evening, as the hum of conversation filled the air and the wine glasses caught the golden light, the door opened again. Heads turned. Whispers rippled like a tide. Laura walked in. She wasn't invited, but of course she came. Of course she had to see. Dressed impeccably, wearing confidence like armor, she crossed the room with that same smile she once wore when we built Hearth and Honey. She paused, letting people see her as if this too were a stage. But beneath the poise I caught the flicker of recognition. She smelled the air and she knew. The honey, the lavender, the faint note of citrus she once mocked me for using. She approached the counter separating the dining room from the kitchen, resting her manicured hands against the glass, scanning the space that mirrored the ambition she once claimed as her own. And for the briefest moment, the room around her faded, replaced by a silent confrontation years in the making. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The staff continued with precision, unbothered, professional. Guests watched, intrigued, unaware of the depth of history unfolding before them. To them, this was just another curious visit from a rival restaurateur. But to me, it was the completion of a circle, the thief standing inside the empire her betrayal had built. Laura requested a table. I allowed it. Let her taste what she once tried to steal. From across the room, I watched her dine. Every bite seemed slower, heavier, as though memory itself had flavor. When the reclaimed arrived, she hesitated. Her fork hovered for a long moment before breaking the surface of the dessert. The taste, when it hit her tongue, told the truth words never could. She froze just for an instant, then composed herself, glancing up toward the kitchen. Our eyes met through the glass. There was no triumph in my gaze, no malice, only clarity. She lowered her eyes and finished her meal in silence. By the end of the night, the reviews began trickling onto phones and tablets. Providence sets a new culinary standard, artistry reborn from adversity, a masterclass in reinvention. The words glowed on screens like quiet flames. The critics compared my dishes to music, to emotion, to resurrection. Favia's social media exploded with praise. And amidst the flood of acclaim, a subtler wave rose, the questioning of authenticity. People began remembering the origins of Amber Table and its suspiciously familiar recipes. The tide was turning. As the last guests left and the staff gathered, exhausted but radiant, I stood alone in the center of Providence. Candles had burned low, the hum of the kitchen faded to a satisfied hush. Outside, the town glittered faintly under the streetlights. For the first time in years, I felt still. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but something irreversible had shifted. Tonight wasn't just about redemption. It was about reclaiming the narrative, rewriting the story they thought they'd stolen. And as I turned off the lights, the scent of lavender lingered in the air, faint, sweet, and victorious. Tomorrow, the world would talk. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. By morning, the storm had begun to roll through Favia, not with thunder or lightning, but with headlines, whispers, and screens glowing in every café. The name Providence spread like wildfire, laced with awe and speculation. Articles described it as a rebirth, a reclamation of art, and a masterpiece that redefines local dining. But beneath the praise, another current stirred, one that spelled doom for Amber Table. The first signs were subtle. A critic, known for his sharp tongue, posted a photo of the reclaimed on social media with the caption, "Funny how authenticity tastes different when it's real." Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Food bloggers began digging. Old photos resurfaced, snapshots of Hearth and Honey's honey lavender pie from years ago, placed side by side with Amber Table's version. The resemblance was undeniable. Soon, threads appeared on forums, dissecting timelines, ownership papers, and old interviews. Someone uncovered archived bakery menus bearing my signature dessert. Another unearthed footage from a local news segment, a younger me, standing beside Laura, proudly presenting the very pie that launched our dream. The truth had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Now the world finally noticed. By noon, Fovya's food community was in uproar. Words like stolen, cupud, and betrayed filled comment sections. Customers began canceling reservations at Amber Table, posting screenshots of their refunds with statements like "We support originality and integrity tastes better." For the first time, Amber Table's perfect image began to crack. Inside her sleek restaurant, Laura was losing control of the narrative. Witnesses later described her as pale, frantic, and defiant. She called her PR manager, her lawyer, her staff, demanding answers, demanding silence, demanding someone to blame. But she couldn't silence the internet, not this time. Her staff whispered behind closed doors. They'd always suspected something wasn't right, that her so-called creative genius seemed borrowed, rehearsed. Some of them had worked with us at Hearth and Honey years before. They knew the real story. Now they watched karma unfold with quiet satisfaction. And I didn't gloat. I didn't even speak publicly. Silence was my weapon now. I let Providence's brilliance speak for me. Each night our tables were booked solid. The waiting list stretched weeks ahead. Influencers clamored for seats while food critics returned for second reviews, calling the experience transcendent and emotionally layered. Providence wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a movement, a symbol of authenticity reclaiming its throne. Meanwhile, Laura tried to fight back. She released statements about misunderstandings, claiming inspiration rather than imitation. But her words fell flat, too polished, too rehearsed. Every time she spoke, someone else posted another piece of evidence, another dated photograph, another staff testimony. The walls around Amber Table began to crumble. Financial pressure followed quickly. Cancellations bled into empty seats. Suppliers, wary of public association, began withdrawing contracts. Investors pulled out, citing ethical concerns. The sleek, modern glow of Amber Table dimmed as half the dining room sat vacant on weekends. And then came the review. It was written by the same critic who had once declared Amber Table revolutionary. Now, in a scathing editorial titled "The Hollow Taste of Imitation," he detailed the unraveling of the lie, from the stolen recipes to the false narrative of genius. Amber Table was built on borrowed brilliance, he wrote, and borrowed brilliance can't withstand the weight of truth. The article went viral. Overnight, Amber Table became a cautionary tale. Hashtags trended: recipe revenge, taste of justice, Providence prevails. Local TV stations picked up the story. Even national outlets ran short segments portraying me as a figure of resilience, the betrayed baker turned culinary powerhouse. It should have felt satisfying. But as I stood inside Providence, watching the wave of attention grow, the emotion was more complex. Vindication was sweet, yes, but it came laced with sorrow for what had been lost. Once, Laura and I had dreamed together. We had shared ovens, laughter, ambition. Somewhere amid the fame and greed, she had traded all that for the illusion of success. The fall wasn't just professional, it was personal. Within weeks, Amber Table's decline became impossible to ignore. Furniture began disappearing from the dining room. Staff left quietly. Rumors swirled that Laura had sold off her wine inventory to cover debts. By the time I walked past the building one evening, the lights were dimmed and a handwritten sign hung in the window, closed for renovation. But everyone knew better. It wasn't renovation, it was collapse. Still, I couldn't quite let go. I visited the waterfront one night, standing across from the reflection of Providence shimmering in the bay. The restaurant glowed behind me, alive with laughter and light, the sound of triumph. And across town, Amber Table stood dark and silent. Two worlds divided by truth. I thought of Laura then, wondering what she must be feeling. Shame, anger, regret, or perhaps nothing at all. Perhaps she was too proud to feel anything. But destiny wasn't finished. The final act was still unfolding. 1 week later, I received a letter hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, heavy and expensive. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Laura's. The message was short: "You think this is over, but I'm not done." A signature, a flourish, and nothing else. For a long moment I stood in my office holding that letter, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the paper. Outside, Providence buzzed with joy and celebration. Inside, something colder began to stir. The fall of Amber Table had been swift and satisfying. But Laura, she was not one to accept defeat quietly. And as the sun sank over Fairview, painting the sky in shades of gold and smoke, I realized one thing: the battle wasn't over. It was merely shifting. The thief had been unmasked, but thieves rarely walk away. They come back for one last grasp at what they've lost. And this time she wouldn't be coming for a recipe. She'd be coming for me. The letter lay on my desk for days, its presence heavier than the paper it was written on. I didn't open Providence that morning with the same easy stride I'd grown used to. Instead, I entered with a quiet wariness, scanning the shadows like they might whisper her name. Laura's promise, "You think this is over, but I'm not done," echoed through my head like a curse and a dare. Fairview had already crowned its victor. Providence was thriving beyond imagination. Every night, tables filled with guests eager to witness the phenomenon. Every morning, new reviews praised the art, the precision, the heart. But behind the applause, I felt it, the pulse of something darker returning, the faint tremor of unfinished business. I told myself I wouldn't give her space in my thoughts, that I'd already won. But denial doesn't stop the wind from shifting. It began with small, unexplainable things. A supplier called, confused about a double order, one placed by me, another by someone claiming to represent Providence. Then a shipment of specialty flour arrived spoiled, its seal broken, the contents damp. A new intern quit without notice, leaving behind whispers that a former associate had warned them Providence was doomed. Each incident was minor, almost laughable in isolation. But together they formed a pattern. Laura was still out there, and she was clawing for relevance. One evening after service, I walked the empty floor of the restaurant. The candlelight trembled against glass and steel, throwing faint reflections of myself across the windows. The dining room, usually so alive, now felt like a stage between acts. I knew she was somewhere nearby, not physically perhaps, but in the air, in the tension that clung to every corner of my rebuilt world. When Amber Table finally closed for good, I thought it would bring closure. Instead, it freed her to scheme without consequence. Reports surfaced that she'd filed for bankruptcy, that she'd lost her investors, that her house was up for sale. Each revelation brought a flicker of satisfaction, followed by a strange unease. Desperation breeds danger, and Laura, cornered and humiliated, would not go quietly. The first real blow came 3 weeks later. It was a Friday night peak service, the hum of conversation thick and joyous. Plates flew from the kitchen like choreography, perfect, polished, purposeful. Then suddenly the lights flickered, once, twice. Then everything went black, gasps filled the room. The emergency lights buzzed to life, washing the dining area in a ghostly red hue. The staff scrambled to calm guests, their voices steady but strained. In the kitchen, I heard the whine of the refrigerators shutting off, the hiss of extinguished flames. For 30 minutes, Providence went dark. When the power returned, the mood had shifted. Some guests laughed it off, others left early, muttering about bad luck. It was more than bad luck. The power company confirmed later that the outage had been caused by tampering, a deliberate sabotage in the control box outside the building. No one saw who did it. No cameras caught it. But I didn't need evidence. I already knew whose fingerprints were on that silence. Laura was making her return known. That night I sat alone in my office long after the staff had gone home. The city outside glimmered, oblivious. I pulled out her letter again, reading the words until the ink felt etched into me. She wanted me to react, to break composure, to lash out. But she had underestimated me before, and she was doing it again. If she wanted war, I would fight it on my terms. I hired security. I reinforced the restaurant's locks, installed cameras, and warned my staff to stay cautious. Yet despite all precautions, a shadow of tension crept into Providence's rhythm. Each noise in the alley, each unfamiliar face at the window stirred a flicker of unease. The restaurant still thrived outwardly, reservations booked, critics returned, but internally I was bracing for impact. The second strike came in the form of rumor. An anonymous post appeared online, claiming Providence's recipes were plagiarized, stolen, ironically from Amber Table. The irony was laughable, the lie transparent, but the internet thrives on doubt. Within hours, forums reignited debates, rehashing the past, muddying the truth. I refused to respond publicly, knowing silence was stronger than defensiveness. Still, I felt the sting. Laura wasn't after my reputation this time, she was after my peace. Then one evening she appeared. It was late after closing. The staff had gone home, the dining room was dim, and I was finishing paperwork in the glow of my desk lamp. The doorbell chimed softly once, twice. My first thought was that someone had forgotten something, but when I looked up she was standing there. Laura, she looked diminished. The immaculate perfection she once radiated was gone. Her hair, once meticulously styled, fell in loose disarray. Her clothes hung on her like fabric clinging to exhaustion. Yet her eyes, those sharp, restless eyes, still burned with something volatile. She didn't speak. Neither did I. We stood in silence, the distance between us heavy with history. She glanced around the restaurant, her gaze sweeping over the tables, the lights, the open kitchen, the framed photographs of Providence's milestones. I watched her jaw tighten, her breath catch. It was the look of someone confronting the ghost of what could have been. Finally, she reached into her bag and set something on the counter, a worn notebook. My notebook, the original hearth and honey recipe book, the one she'd stolen. Sight of it stole my breath for a moment. The pages were frayed, the leather scuffed, the faint scent of flour and sugar still clinging to it. My handwriting stared back at me from the open page, honey lavender pie, batch 47. She met my eyes then, and I understood. This wasn't an apology. It was surrender disguised as pride. She was giving it back not to make peace, but to remind me what she once had and lost. A gesture of defiance twisted into confession. I didn't take the book. Not immediately. I let the silence hang between us, heavy and final. Then, without a word, she turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind her, the chime echoing through the empty restaurant like the toll of an ending. I stood there for a long time, staring at the notebook. When I finally picked it up, I felt no anger, only clarity. The recipes inside were relics of who I once was, but I didn't need them anymore. Providence was beyond those pages now. Laura's shadow had lingered long enough. Still, something in her eyes haunted me, the wildness of someone with nothing left to lose. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the true ending. People like her don't fade quietly into the background. They implode spectacularly. And when they do, they try to take everything else down with them. The morning after Laura's visit, the world felt unnervingly still. Providence gleamed as it always did, polished silver, spotless glass, the faint hum of a kitchen coming alive. But beneath the familiar rhythm, an unease throbbed like a heartbeat just beneath the floorboards. Her presence lingered. Not physically, she was gone, vanished into whatever shadows she now called home, but the echo of her return had settled deep into my bones. I'd thought that handing back the stolen recipe book meant something final. Closure, maybe. But closure is an illusion for those who have been burned. It never truly ends. It just quiets, waiting. That night, I found out how right I was. It began innocently, as all disasters do, a full house, laughter spilling across tables, the sizzle of pans, the flick of knives in perfect rhythm. The night had the energy of triumph, almost cinematic in its perfection. A food critic from a national magazine was dining in the corner booth, scribbling notes between bites of seared salmon and honey-drizzled greens. The scent of lavender and roasted garlic filled the air. Everything was working. Everything was alive. Then faintly I smelled smoke. At first it was subtle, a whisper beneath the layers of food and heat. But then it thickened. The sharp, acrid scent cut through the aroma of dinner like a knife. My instincts flared. I looked toward the kitchen where the stainless steel sheen was now touched by a faint, dancing orange reflection. Flames. They were small at first, licking the edge of a towel near the back stove. My chefs rushed to smother it, but when one grabbed the extinguisher, it didn't work. Neither did the second. Panic spread fast, too fast. A second ignition point flared near the dry storage area, then a third near the electrical outlet. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I didn't need proof to know who had done it. Laura's parting gift wasn't the notebook, it was this. I moved quickly, shouting orders, ushering guests toward the exits. The staff performed like a trained unit, guiding people through emergency routes, covering mouths, staying calm even as the heat began to climb. The fire alarm screamed through the restaurant, red lights strobing across faces filled with disbelief and fear. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, the contrast brutal against the heat building behind the walls. From across the street, I watched my creation burn. Flames clawed at the windows, bursting through with a sound like glass screaming. Sparks spiraled into the dark, lighting up the night sky. Providence, the embodiment of every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every ounce of defiance, was devoured by orange and black. I could hear the fire department arriving, sirens slicing through the chaos, but I already knew the truth. The building was gone. Yet as I stood there, surrounded by smoke, onlookers, and chaos, I didn't crumble. Something within me refused to break. Maybe it was shock, maybe pride, but deep down I realized this wasn't destruction. It was transformation. Laura had taken everything once before. She had stolen my recipe, my reputation, and nearly my sanity. And now she had tried to take the empire that rose from those ashes. But here's the thing about fire: it doesn't just destroy, it purifies. When the last ember dimmed and the smoke began to drift into the early morning, I felt something shift inside me. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me unstoppable. In the days that followed, investigators confirmed what I already knew: accelerants, timers, multiple points of origin. It was arson, calculated and cruel. And the evidence led directly back to Laura. A neighbor's security camera caught her car parked near Providence the night before. Traces of gasoline were found in the trunk. They arrested her within the week. When I saw her mugshot on the news, something inside me twisted, not satisfaction, not joy, but a quiet, hollow kind of relief. The fight was over. The reckoning had come. The public reaction was immediate. What was meant to be a scandal turned into solidarity. The community rallied around me. Former critics, guests, even rival chefs reached out. Donations poured in, messages of support flooded my inbox, and the story of Providence and its fall became national news. But I didn't rebuild Providence right away. Instead, I traveled. I visited old towns, small kitchens, and hidden bakeries across the country. I watched people cook with passion, untouched by fame, recipes passed down through generations, measured not in cups but in instinct. I remembered why I had started cooking in the first place. It wasn't about victory. It was about creation, connection, and the power of turning raw ingredients into something transcendent. 6 months later, I opened my new restaurant. It wasn't as grand as Providence. It was smaller, quieter, set in an old converted farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The walls were warm wood, the tables handcrafted, the lights soft and forgiving. I named it Ember. On opening night, I stood in the kitchen, watching as the first guests arrived. Familiar faces, my old staff, loyal patrons, new supporters. The smell of honey and lavender once again filled the air, but this time it carried something different: peace. I hung one item on the wall above the kitchen pass. A single framed page from my old recipe notebook, singed slightly at the edges, rescued from the ruins of Providence. The title read, Honey Lavender Pie, Batch 47. It wasn't there to remind me of what I'd lost, but of what I'd built and rebuilt from the ashes. Laura's name faded from headlines, her restaurant a ghost story in culinary circles. But mine became something more than fame. It became legacy. Because in the end, she stole a recipe. I built an empire. And when that empire burned, I built something even stronger. The fire had taken my restaurant, but it gave me back my purpose. And as I watched my new guests lift their forks, tasting the pie that had started everything, I realized the truth I'd been circling for years. Some recipes aren't just for food, they're for resilience, for rebirth, for revenge that tastes like victory.